Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into one of Padre Pio's most haunting experiences, something that shook him to his core and changed how he understood the connection between the living and the dead. If you've been following these stories, you already know that Padre Pio saw beyond the veil that separates our world from eternity. But this particular encounter was different. This was about what happens when we turn away from a soul in desperate need, when we ignore the cries of someone reaching across death itself, pleading for our prayers. Padre Pio once said something that left everyone who heard it speechless. He said that the greatest tragedy in the spiritual world is not a soul being lost to hell, but a soul being forgotten by the living. Because when the dead are forgotten, when their names are no longer spoken in prayer, when no one remembers to offer a single Hail Mary for their eternal rest, they remain trapped in a darkness that grows deeper with each passing day. But what does that really mean? What exactly happens when we ignore a soul asking for prayer? Padre Pio witnessed it firsthand, and what he saw was so disturbing, so heartbreaking, that he carried the weight of it for the rest of his life. He saw souls who had been abandoned by the living, souls who cried out night after night for just one prayer, one small act of mercy, one moment of remembrance, and he saw what happened when those cries went unanswered. The story begins on a cold winter night in San Giovanni Rotondo. The monastery was silent except for the wind rattling the old windows and the soft shuffle of Padre Pio's sandals as he made his way to the chapel for his nightly vigil. He had been feeling restless all evening, sensing something in the air, something that made the hair on his arms stand up and his heart beat faster. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that someone or something was trying to reach him. As he knelt before the tabernacle, his rosary beads slipping through his fingers, the temperature in the chapel began to drop. Not the natural cold of winter, but something else. Something that seemed to seep through the very walls and settle into his bones. The candles flickered, their flames dancing wildly despite the absence of any wind. And then, in the corner of his vision, he saw movement. At first, it was just a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, hovering near the back of the chapel. But as Padre Pio continued to pray, trying to focus on his devotions while this presence grew stronger, the shadow began to take shape. It was a figure, hunched and trembling, with clothes that seemed to hang like rags from its skeletal frame. The figure moved slowly, painfully, as if each step required tremendous effort. Padre Pio later described this soul as one of the most pitiful sights he had ever witnessed. The figure was neither man nor woman, but something caught between life and death, between hope and despair. Its face was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, with eyes that burned not with fire, but with an ache so deep it seemed to consume everything around it. This was not the peaceful countenance of a soul at rest, nor was it the terrifying visage of the damned. This was something far more heartbreaking. This was a soul that had been forgotten. The figure approached the altar where Padre Pio knelt, moving with the slow, labored gait of someone who had been wandering for an eternity. When it finally spoke, its voice was barely a whisper, cracked and dry like autumn leaves scraping across stone. It said only one word, but that word contained a universe of suffering. Please. Padre Pio felt his heart break as he looked into those hollow eyes. He could see the story written there, the long years of waiting, of calling out to the living world, of hoping that someone, anyone, would remember to pray. This soul had been dead for decades, trapped in a limbo of spiritual desolation, crying out for prayers that never came. Its family had moved on. Its friends had forgotten, and the world had erased its memory completely. The soul continued to speak, its words coming in broken fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror, reflecting fragments of a life once lived. It told Padre Pio about the loved ones left behind, about the promises made at the funeral that were quickly broken, about the masses that were supposed to be said but never were. It spoke of watching from the threshold of eternity as its own children grew up, married, had children of their own, all while never once mentioning its name in prayer. What Padre Pio witnessed next was something that would haunt him for the rest of his earthly life. He saw how abandonment by the living affected souls in the afterlife. He watched as the very essence of this forgotten soul began to fade. not disappearing entirely, but growing dimmer, like a candle slowly burning out in a windless room. The soul was not being punished by God, Padre Pio realized. It was being starved by the neglect of those who should have remembered it. He saw that prayers from the living are like spiritual nourishment for souls in purgatory. Without them, these souls grow weak, their purification process slows to an agonizing crawl, and their hope begins to dim. They remain trapped in a state of spiritual hunger, able to see the light of heaven but unable to reach it without the helping hand of prayer from those still on earth. The forgotten soul showed Padre Pio visions of its life, flashing images of moments of kindness, acts of love, sacrifices made for family and friends. It had been a good person, not perfect, but genuinely caring and devoted. Yet here it was, decades after death, still waiting for the prayers that would help it complete its journey to God. The tragedy was not in the soul's unworthiness, but in the world's forgetfulness. As the night wore on, Padre Pio learned more about the mysterious connection between the living and the dead. He discovered that souls in purgatory are acutely aware of what happens on earth. They know when they are remembered, when masses are offered for them, when their names are spoken in prayer, but they also know when they are forgotten, when their earthly ties are severed by indifference, when the living move on without looking back. The forgotten soul explained to Padre Pio that there are countless others like it, souls who have been abandoned by the living, who wander in spiritual desolation because no one thinks to pray for them. Some died in hospitals with no family present. Others were buried in unmarked graves. Still others were simply forgotten as the generations passed, their names erased from memory, their stories untold. But the most heartbreaking cases, the soul revealed, were those who had been deliberately ignored. Souls whose living relatives knew they should pray for them but chose not to. Souls whose families had been hurt or angry and decided that the dead no longer deserved their prayers. These souls suffered not just from spiritual hunger, but from the added weight of rejection, knowing that they were remembered but deemed unworthy of mercy. Padre Pio felt a profound sorrow wash over him as he absorbed this revelation. He realized that in his focus on the dramatic visions of heaven and hell, he had overlooked this quieter tragedy, this slow spiritual starvation of the forgotten dead. He understood now that ignoring a soul asking for prayer was not just a missed opportunity for charity. It was a form of spiritual cruelty, an abandonment that echoed through eternity. The forgotten soul continued to plead, its voice growing weaker with each word. It begged not for elaborate ceremonies or expensive masses, but for the simplest acts of remembrance. A single Hail Mary, a moment of silence, a brief prayer before sleep, just something, anything, to acknowledge its existence and its need for help in completing its journey to God. As Padre Pio watched this soul's desperate plea, something even more disturbing began to unfold. The forgotten soul started to show him what happens when prayers are consistently ignored, when the living turn their backs completely on those who need their help. He witnessed a spiritual phenomenon that chilled him to his very core. The soul's form began to change before his eyes, not dramatically, not violently, but with a slow, agonizing deterioration that spoke of years upon years of neglect. Its already dim light grew dimmer still, and Padre Pio could see that this wasn't just sadness or longing. This was something far more serious. This was a soul beginning to lose hope itself. Padre Pio later described this moment as watching someone slowly drown in spiritual quicksand. The more the soul struggled to reach the living world, the deeper it sank into despair. Its prayers became weaker, its voice fainter, its very essence more fragile. He realized he was witnessing what happens when abandonment becomes so complete that a soul starts to doubt whether anyone cares about its eternal fate. But then the vision shifted, and Padre Pio saw something that made his blood run cold. Behind the forgotten soul, in the deepest shadows of the chapel, other figures began to emerge. Dozens of them, hundreds, all with the same hollow eyes, the same desperate expressions, the same fading light. They moved like a silent procession of the abandoned, each one carrying the weight of years, decades, sometimes centuries of being ignored by the living. These were the forgotten masses, Padre Pio realized. Souls who had died without anyone to remember them, or whose families had simply stopped caring. They gathered around him like moths drawn to flame, each one silently pleading for acknowledgement, for prayer, for the simple mercy of being remembered. The sight was overwhelming, a sea of spiritual suffering that stretched beyond what his human mind could fully comprehend. One by one, they began to tell their stories. The elderly woman who died alone in a nursing home, her children too busy with their own lives to visit or pray. The soldier who fell in battle, his body never recovered, his name never spoken by those he died protecting. The infant who lived only hours after birth, forgotten by everyone except God himself. The homeless man who froze to death on a winter street, unknown and unmourned by the world that had ignored him in life. Each story cut deeper into Padre Pio's heart. He began to understand the true scope of the crisis he was witnessing. These weren't just individual tragedies. This was a systematic abandonment of the dead by the living, a breaking of the sacred bond that should connect all members of the human family across the divide of death. The forgotten souls showed him how their abandonment created a vicious cycle. As they grew weaker from lack of prayer, they became less able to intercede for the living. The spiritual connection between earth and eternity grew thinner, leaving both worlds poorer. The living lost the protection and guidance of grateful souls, while the dead remained trapped in their purification without the helping hand they desperately needed. Padre Pio watched in horror as he saw some souls begin to turn away from the light entirely. Not because they chose evil, but because their hope had been so thoroughly crushed that they could no longer believe in the possibility of redemption. They started to retreat into themselves, wrapping their despair around them like a shroud, becoming so lost in their abandonment that they forgot how to reach toward God. This, Padre Pio realized, was perhaps the most insidious danger of ignoring souls in need. It wasn't just that they suffered from lack of prayer. It was that prolonged abandonment could lead them to a state of spiritual despair so deep that they lost the ability to accept help even when it was finally offered. They became prisoners not just of purgatory, but of their own broken trust in the love of God and humanity. The vision intensified as Padre Pio was shown the moment when neglect transforms into something far more serious. He witnessed souls who had been forgotten for so long that they began to forget themselves. Their memories of earthly love grew dim, their understanding of their own worth faded, and their connection to the divine became strained almost to the breaking point. These souls hadn't chosen damnation, but their abandonment by the living had created wounds so deep that healing seemed almost impossible. They existed in a twilight realm between hope and despair, neither advancing toward heaven nor falling into hell, but trapped in a limbo of their own making, constructed from years of unanswered pleas and ignored suffering. The forgotten soul that had first approached Padre Pio now pointed to the darkest corner of the chapel, where the most abandoned souls lingered. These were the ones who had given up entirely on ever receiving help from the living. They no longer called out, no longer pleaded, no longer hoped. They simply existed in a state of profound spiritual isolation, cut off from both earth and heaven by the depth of their abandonment. Padre Pio felt tears streaming down his face as he absorbed the full magnitude of what he was seeing. This wasn't just about individual souls suffering in purgatory. This was about the breakdown of one of the most fundamental aspects of Christian love, the communion of saints that should unite all believers across the boundaries of life and death. He began to understand why the Church had always emphasized prayers for the dead, why the tradition of remembering the departed was so central to Christian practice. It wasn't just a nice gesture or a comforting ritual. It was a spiritual lifeline, a vital connection that kept souls from drowning in the ocean of their own purification. The forgotten souls continued to gather around him, their numbers growing until the chapel seemed filled with an army of the abandoned. But even as their presence grew more overwhelming, Padre Pio noticed something else, a faint glimmer of hope in their eyes as they looked at him. They recognized that he could see them, that he understood their plight, that through him their voices might finally be heard. The original soul stepped forward again, its voice barely audible but filled with desperate urgency. It whispered to Padre Pio about the others still trapped in deeper darkness, souls who had been forgotten for so long that they could no longer even appear to the living. These were the truly lost, not because God had abandoned them, but because humanity had, and their own despair had become a prison from which they could not escape. Escape. The forgotten soul's whisper carried a weight that seemed to press against Padre Pio's chest. It spoke of layers beneath layers, depths of abandonment so profound that even God's infinite mercy struggled to penetrate the walls these souls had built around themselves. These were not walls of sin or rebellion, but walls of broken trust, constructed brick by brick through years of unanswered prayers and silent nights. Padre Pio learned that when a soul cries out for prayer and receives only silence, something inside it begins to change. The first few years of abandonment bring sadness, then longing, then desperate pleading. But as decades pass without response, that pleading transforms into something darker. The soul begins to believe that perhaps it truly is unworthy of love, that maybe its suffering is deserved, that the silence from the living world is God's own judgment upon it. The forgotten soul showed him visions of what this looked like in the spiritual realm. Padre Pio watched as souls gradually pulled away from the light, not because they rejected it, but because they had convinced themselves they had no right to approach it. They created their own purgatories within purgatory, chambers of self-imposed exile, where they punished themselves with isolation, more complete than any external judgment could devise. He saw souls who had once been mothers, fathers, children, friends, now huddled alone in corners of eternity, whispering to themselves the names of those who had forgotten them. They rehearsed memories of earthly love like prayers, clinging to fragments of connection that grew dimmer with each passing year. Some had forgotten their own names, knowing themselves only as the abandoned ones, the unwanted dead, the souls too insignificant to remember. What struck Padre Pio most deeply was how these souls still loved those who had forgotten them. Even in their abandonment, even in their despair, they continued to long for their families, to worry about their welfare, to wish they could somehow reach across the divide and offer comfort. Their love had not died with their bodies, but their ability to express that love had been severed by the silence of the living. The forgotten soul explained that this was perhaps the cruelest aspect of abandonment. The dead do not stop loving the living when they die. If anything, their love becomes purer, more intense, freed from the petty concerns and distractions of earthly life. But when that love is met with indifference or forgetfulness, it becomes a source of agony rather than joy. The souls ache not just for their own salvation, but for the opportunity to pour out their love on those they left behind. Padre Pio witnessed souls who spent their time watching over families who never spoke their names. He saw a grandmother's spirit hovering protectively over grandchildren who had never learned her story. A father's soul weeping as he watched his son make the same mistakes he had made, powerless to guide him because no prayer had ever opened a channel for communication. These souls lived in a hell of loving silence, able to see but not touch, to care but not help, to remember but not be remembered. The vision deepened, and Padre Pio was shown the moment when abandonment reaches its most dangerous point. He watched as souls who had been forgotten for generations began to lose their grip on their own identity. Without the anchor of human memory, without the validation of prayer, they started to fade, not just in brightness, but in substance. They became spiritual echoes of themselves, shadows of souls, rather than souls themselves. These fading ones gathered in the darkest recesses of the spiritual realm, neither advancing toward heaven nor falling toward hell, but existing in a liminal space that seemed to grow smaller and more suffocating with each passing century. They whispered among themselves in voices so faint they could barely be heard, sharing stories of the living world they had once known, trying desperately to hold on to the memories that were all they had left. Padre Pio learned that there were souls in this condition who had been dead for hundreds of years, forgotten so completely that not even their graves remained marked. They had become orphans of eternity, cut off from both the community of the living and the communion of saints. Some had been dead so long that the very languages they spoke had evolved beyond recognition, leaving them unable even to communicate with newly deceased souls. The forgotten soul showed him something even more heartbreaking. It revealed that these abandoned spirits could see the prayers being offered for other souls, could witness the beautiful release that came when masses were said, when names were remembered, when love reached across death to pull a soul toward the light. They watched this spiritual rescue happen again and again for others, while they themselves remained trapped in their isolation, invisible and unheard. But then the vision shifted, and Padre Pio saw something that gave him hope, even in the midst of such overwhelming sorrow. He witnessed moments when forgotten souls were suddenly remembered, when someone stumbled across an old photograph, when a genealogist researched a family tree, when a stranger walking through a cemetery felt moved to pray for the unknown dead. In these moments, he watched souls who had been fading suddenly brighten, their forms becoming more solid, their voices growing stronger. He saw that even the smallest act of remembrance could pierce through decades of abandonment. A single prayer, offered with sincere intention for the forgotten dead, could reach souls who had been lost in darkness for generations. The power of that prayer was magnified by the very depth of the soul's need, like water poured onto parched ground, soaking in immediately and bringing life where there had been only spiritual drought. The forgotten soul explained to Padre Pio that this was why the saints had always emphasized prayers for the dead, especially for those who had no one to pray for them. It wasn't just charity, it was rescue work. Every prayer for an unknown soul was like throwing a rope to someone drowning in an ocean of abandonment, offering them a lifeline back to hope and eventual salvation. Padre Pio learned that the Church's tradition of praying for all the faithful departed wasn't just a beautiful custom, but a spiritual necessity. Without these general prayers, countless souls would remain trapped in the isolation of abandonment, forgotten by their families, but not forgotten by God, who works through the prayers of the living to reach those who have been left behind. The vision continued to unfold, showing Padre Pio the network of spiritual connection that should exist between the living and the dead. He saw it as a vast web of light, with prayers traveling like electrical impulses between earth and eternity. But in many places, that web was broken, severed by forgetfulness, indifference, or the simple passage of time. Where the connections were strong, souls moved freely toward their ultimate destination. Where they were weak or broken, souls remained trapped in spiritual isolation. He witnessed the moment when a soul finally received its first prayer after years of abandonment. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Light flooded into the darkness where the soul had been hiding, not harsh or blinding, but gentle and warm like sunrise after the longest night. The soul's form became more substantial, its voice grew clearer, and most importantly, hope returned to its eyes. The forgotten soul told Padre Pio that receiving even one sincere prayer after long abandonment was like being born again. It reminded the soul that it was still loved, still remembered, still worthy of salvation. It broke through the walls of despair that had been constructed over years of silence and opened the possibility of spiritual progress once more. But the soul also warned him about something else. It spoke of souls who had been abandoned for so long that they had forgotten how to receive prayer, how to accept help, how to believe in the possibility of love. These souls required not just prayer, but patient, persistent prayer, offered again and again until the walls of their self-imposed isolation finally crumbled. Padre Pio saw that ignoring a soul asking for prayer created a cascade of spiritual damage that extended far beyond the individual soul. It weakened the entire communion of saints, reduced the flow of grace between earth and heaven, and left the living world spiritually impoverished. When souls were abandoned, their potential intercession for the living was lost. Their wisdom remained unshared, and their love had no channel for expression. The forgotten souls gathered closer around Padre Pio as the night deepened, each one adding its voice to the chorus of the abandoned. They spoke of children who grew up never hearing their grandparents' names, of families who moved away from ancestral homes and left their dead behind, of communities that forgot their own history and the souls who had built their foundations. They told him about the loneliness of watching the world change without being able to participate, of seeing new generations born who would never know their stories, of witnessing the gradual erosion of the very memory of their existence. They spoke of the particular pain of watching their own graves become overgrown and forgotten, their headstones worn smooth by weather until even their names disappeared from the earth. But even as they shared their sorrow, these souls also spoke of their enduring faith. Despite their abandonment by the living, they had not abandoned their faith in God. They continued to trust that somehow, some way, mercy would find them. They held on to hope even when hope seemed impossible, believing that their suffering had meaning, that their patience would be rewarded, that love would ultimately triumph over forgetfulness. Padre Pio felt the weight of their collective sorrow pressing down on him like a physical burden. He understood now why he had been shown this vision, why these souls had been allowed to appear to him. He was meant to be their voice, their advocate, their connection back to the world of the living. Through him, their stories would be told, their plight would be known, and perhaps their abandonment could finally come to an end. The forgotten soul that had first approached him now stepped forward one last time. Its form was becoming translucent as the night wore on, fading like mist before the dawn. But its voice carried a message that would echo in Padre Pio's heart for the rest of his life. It spoke of the power that every living person possessed, the ability to reach across death itself and offer comfort to those in need. It reminded him that prayer for the dead was not just about helping souls in purgatory, but about maintaining the sacred connection between all members of God's family. When the living remembered the dead, when they offered prayers and masses and small acts of remembrance, they kept alive the truth that love is stronger than death, that the bonds of family and friendship transcend the grave. Transcend the grave. The forgotten soul's voice grew weaker as it delivered its final message, but every word burned itself into Padre Pio's memory. It spoke of a truth that the living world had forgotten, a spiritual law as real as gravity itself. When prayers stop flowing to the dead, when names are no longer spoken, when masses are no longer offered, something breaks in the very fabric of creation. The communion of saints becomes fractured, leaving both worlds poorer for the separation. As the soul spoke, Padre Pio began to understand the full scope of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just about individual suffering or personal tragedy. This was about the systematic breakdown of one of Christianity's most fundamental teachings. The Church had always insisted that the living and the dead remained connected, that prayers could reach across eternity, that love transcended death itself. But what happened when that connection was severed by indifference? The forgotten soul showed him the answer. It revealed a spiritual wasteland, populated by souls who had been cut off from the flow of grace that should have carried them home. They existed in a state of suspended animation, neither progressing toward heaven nor falling toward hell, but trapped in a limbo, created not by divine judgment, but by human forgetfulness. Padre Pio watched as the soul pointed toward the deepest shadows of the chapel, where the most abandoned spirits dwelt. These were souls who had been forgotten so completely that they had begun to forget themselves. Their memories of earthly life had grown dim, their sense of identity had faded, and their connection to the divine had become so tenuous that they could barely perceive the light they were meant to approach. The sight filled Padre Pio with a horror deeper than anything he had experienced in his visions of hell. At least the damned had chosen their fate, had actively rejected God's mercy. But these souls had committed no such rebellion. Their only crime was being forgotten by those who should have loved them most. They suffered not from divine wrath, but from human negligence, trapped in a prison built from indifference and sealed with silence. The forgotten soul explained that these most abandoned spirits represented a growing crisis in the spiritual world. As modern society became more disconnected from tradition, as families scattered across the globe, as the practice of praying for the dead fell into disuse, more and more souls were falling into this terrible limbo. They became spiritual orphans, cut off from both earth and heaven, existing in a twilight realm of their own despair. Padre Pio learned that some of these souls had been trapped for centuries, victims of plagues that wiped out entire families, of wars that left no survivors to remember them, of disasters that erased whole communities from the earth. They had watched the world change around them, seen empires rise and fall, witnessed the birth of new nations and the death of old ways, all while remaining frozen in their abandonment. The most heartbreaking cases were those who had once been deeply loved, but whose families had simply moved on. Children who grew up and forgot their grandparents. Spouses who remarried and rarely spoke their first partner's name. Communities that built new churches and left the old graveyards to decay. These souls carried not just the pain of abandonment, but the memory of love that had once been strong enough to sustain them. As dawn approached that terrible night, Padre Pio made a promise that would shape the rest of his life. He vowed to never let a day pass without praying for the forgotten dead, to become their voice in a world that had grown deaf to their cries. He understood that every prayer offered for an unknown soul was an act of rescue. Every mass said for the departed was a lifeline thrown across eternity. The forgotten souls had shown him a truth that changed everything. We are never truly alone, and love never truly dies. It simply waits for us to remember.